thank you all for being here for this week's brown bag entitled Beyond Asphalt, Highways, Parking, and Sustainability. I hope you all have gotten a chance to grab some pizza, but feel free to get up throughout the event for pizza. And today we have with us Trip Pollard, who's a senior attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center in Richmond, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that works in Virginia and 5 other southern states to protect natural areas and resources in the South. He's the director of SELC's Land and Community Program, which promotes smarter growth and sustainable transportation throughout this region, and he's the head of SELC's Richmond office. Trip has written dozens of reports and articles, including Healthy Community Choices for the Greater Richmond Region, Smart Growth is Smart Economics, Sustainable Development in the Greater Richmond Region, as well as Sustainable Communities, Building for the Future of the Greater Richmond Region, and a chapter on transportation in the book Agenda for Sustainable America. And some of his publications are in the back. Feel free to flip through them or even take a copy if you'd like. He served on numerous governmental commissions and advisory bodies, including the Advisory Committee for the City of Richmond Sustainability Plan and for the Richmond Connects Multimodal Transportation Plan, and he currently chairs Richmond's Green City Commission. He also serves on the board of various organizations, including Virginians for High-Speed Rail, Preservation Virginia, the Partnership for Smarter Growth, and the Virginia Rail Policy Institute. So we are very lucky to have this very accomplished, incredibly busy man with us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Trip.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here with you all today. And we'd like to talk a bit about highways, parking, transportation, land use, environment, the whole nest of those interrelated issues. And especially appropriate since today is Parking Day, which I don't know if many of you are familiar with that, where people across the world transform parking spaces into green spaces to help call attention to how we can use some of our urban open spaces more wisely, as well as the critical debate about transportation, land use, and the environment. So I will say a little bit more about Parking Day at the end, put a plug for some activities. We're very fortunate in the Richmond region. I'm going to talk some about national trends, but more about state and Richmond region on some of these issues as a way to just get at some of the larger issues of transportation, land use, and sustainability. Blessed with a lot of natural resources, as well as areas where agricultural activities and very vibrant cities and towns throughout Virginia and throughout the Richmond region. But we also are seeing a lot of transformation of the landscape, our development and land use patterns in Virginia and this region I'd like to touch on just a moment. And as was mentioned, I work in 6 states throughout the Southeast. So start by looking a little bit at the Southeast and some of the trends starting with 1960. You can see the development growing, the 80, 2000, 2020. So enormous transformation that we've seen throughout our region, as well as in Virginia and the Richmond region in particular. Pulling it down to the Richmond region, seen an average of about 200 acres developed each week. That's actually higher than Northern Virginia or Hampton Roads. People are often surprised to find that the rate of development here has been that fast. During an 8-year period for which we have some pretty good data for, over 21,000 acres were developed in Chesterfield alone. And not surprisingly, one of the consequences of this is the loss of farmland in the region dropped 12% in just 5 years between 2002 and 2007. So we see some rather dramatic changes in the Richmond region in terms of development. As we spread further out, it makes it harder to get to places without driving, and consistent and perpetuating this is the fact that our transportation policies tend to limit choices of transportation. At the federal, state, and local level, we tend to heavily orient our transportation spending towards only one mode of transportation. That's the motor vehicle. So just a little bit on the state of our current transportation system. There are over 4 million miles of paved roads in the country, and estimates are a little across the board, but an estimated roughly 500 to 800 million parking spaces in the United States. So a lot of asphalt, a lot of parking. That's enough to cover roughly the size of the state of West Virginia in asphalt just from parking spaces alone. And we have an average of about 3 spaces per car. So not surprisingly, most of the time, most of the spaces are sitting empty. A few other quick transportation trends, just to give a quick flavor here. People statewide in Virginia drive about 80 billion miles a year. That's more than driving to the sun and back every day statewide in Virginia. In the Richmond region, we actually have the highest driving rate in Virginia of any metro area, more driving per capita than either Northern Virginia or Hampton Roads, about 27 miles per person per day. And here in our region, we drive roughly the distance to the sun every 3 days. Not only is it heavily emphasis on the driving, but countervailing lack of emphasis on other modes of transportation. As a result, the Richmond region actually ranked near the bottom, number 92 out of 100, in terms of major metro areas for public transit coverage and access to jobs. So that's just a really quick snapshot at some of the trends in development and land use. Obviously, these are trends that have been going for quite a while. Some have gained a lot of momentum, and again, this region is changing much more rapidly, I think, than many people realize. I'd like to say a little bit about some of the impacts of these trends. I think the current path we're on is clearly not sustainable from almost any measure or perspective, whether you look at it environmentally, from a health perspective, social impacts, also from an economic and a fiscal impact. So I'd like to touch just very quickly on some of the impacts of these current trends. First, a little bit about the fiscal and economic impacts, which is less the focus of this talk, but it's very important, and it's also, I think, very important to why increasingly some of our state and local decision makers are starting to really pay attention to these problems. For a number of years, it was assumed kind of that all growth is good. I think we started to realize in more recent years that there's a heavy cost to certain patterns of growth, and that we can still have economic development and growth, but at far less fiscal cost and environmental cost. So some of the things that have gotten people's attention are the infrastructure costs. It's incredibly costly to serve growth as you get more scattered and sprawling roads, water, sewer, schools, and the like. It's very costly to taxpayers. And the double whammy, because you have infrastructure that you've already paid for as taxpayers, may be underused, be that parking, roads, water, what have you. Then there's the individual cost, the cost of congestion, but also the cost of driving, owning vehicles. And in fact, the average household in the South spends more on transportation than anything other than housing. And not surprisingly, in more scattered, sprawling areas, the costs of transportation to individual households is the highest nationwide. Also, increasingly awareness that it has impact on economic competitiveness, especially in a more mobile society. Increasing number of businesses, in looking at location decisions, pay a lot more attention to quality of life, because a lot of people don't really want to live in a place where they have to drive everywhere for everything and be stuck in traffic. To give a real quick example of some of the fiscal impacts, looking at the infrastructure costs, this is from a study that was done a number of years ago in the Charlottesville region, looking at 2 scenarios for the future, assuming the exact same amount of economic development, but a different transportation and land use pattern. One assumed kind of a business as usual, more dispersed development, more heavily road-oriented, and they concluded they need about $1 billion in bypasses and wider roads, assuming nothing for transit, to meet the needs in this fairly short time period. If they grew in a more traditional neighborhood development style town, commercial development, they would need to spend half that much, was the estimate, to handle the traffic, just because you wouldn't have to serve such a broad footprint. And you can see, obviously, the environmental impacts would be much less, having so many fewer roads across the landscape. So that's just one example, but increasingly, Chesterfield County's done some fiscal impact analysis recently, so has Henrico. Counties in this region are starting to wake up to the fact that all growth is not created equally. We need to be thinking much more carefully about where we grow and how we grow, not just growth itself. In terms of the personal fiscal impacts, this is just an interesting study done by a group called the Center for Neighborhood Technology. You can find these actually for regions throughout the country, and it explodes kind of an interesting myth that many people think about, but still drives a lot of development in this region. And just to get the big picture, this is actually of the Charlottesville region, But it's true of the Richmond region, it's true of most regions throughout the country, in fact. If you look just at housing costs as a percent of income, the darker, don't expect you to read the key in the back, the darker shows a greater percentage of your income you have to spend for average housing. It's cheaper to live on the fringes, and that's what's driven a fair amount of development. But that's only true if you look at housing cost alone. The other looks at housing plus transportation costs, and it's the exact opposite story. It's actually much cheaper on the whole to live close in because you have far, far lower transportation costs. It's something that has not been factored very well into our whole mortgage system, banking system, development system, but it's a reality that people have increasingly faced and woken up to. Is you looking at housing alone misses much of the picture. Social impacts. As we spend more time driving everywhere, stuck in traffic, obviously that comes at the cost of our communities, our friends, families. It also, more importantly, the lack of alternatives to driving places a real burden on people who can't drive. Either they can't afford a car, they're too old, they're too young. Significant percent of Virginians and in this region can't drive. And if you don't have opportunities to drive, in fact, your ability to get to work, to Medicare, Medicaid, to medical facilities, to get to occupations, to jobs, and the like. And this is just an illustration of some of that limitation in our region. These statistics are a little old, but it will give you the flavor of it. This is looking at the jobs that are paying less than $30,000 in Richmond Metro region and where they're concentrated. And you can see they're a little more the inner suburbs and on the fringes of the region is where more of these jobs are. But if you look at where are the people who have median income household below 30,000, this is the crosshatched area here. It's all in the center of the region. And if you look at where transit runs in our region, it's this red lines, which is also just in the center of this region. So there's no way by transit system that we have today for most of the people who have median household income below 30,000 to reach these types of jobs for which they're most likely to be able to get. Then turn real quickly to some of the environmental and health impacts. Really, there's not a single pressing environmental issue that's not pretty directly tied to our transportation and land use patterns. I mentioned some of the loss of open space and development of farmland, but air pollution, water pollution, climate change, you name it, is pretty directly tied to our transportation and land use patterns. A little bit more on a couple of those. In the Richmond region, we had about 250 violations of federal health standards for ozone from 2000 to 2013. And we actually have one of the highest per capita footprints for emissions of carbon dioxide when you look at our transportation use and our residential energy use. Energy consumption is another impact. Nationwide, we consume about 19 million barrels of oil daily, predominantly for transportation. In Virginia, about 5 billion gallons of motor fuels consumed every year. Among the many impacts, in addition to burning of that fossil fuels, are the production. As we have to go to riskier places to get oil, you have things like Deepwater Horizon, oil spills, and the like, obviously with enormous environmental consequences. And then carbon dioxide emissions. I mentioned the amount of fuel we burn. If you looked at the 6 southern states where we work, if they were a separate country, they would actually be the 7th highest CO2 emitter in the entire world. And Virginia's seen fairly rapid rise in CO2 emissions overall. And again, I mentioned the Richmond area has a very high carbon footprint. This is an interesting, a little bit like the analysis of looking at the impact of the cost of driving. This looks at the CO2 footprint. Again, this was prepared by the Center for Neighborhood Technology. This is of the Richmond region. If you look at it on a per acre basis, which is where a lot of times we tend to think about things, and the environmental movement for quite a while thought about things kind of on that basis. Where are the problems on kind of per acre? You see that emissions are actually fairly low on the fringes, and they're actually fairly high close in. If you look at it on a per capita basis, though, it's the exact opposite. Per capita CO2 emissions are much lower the closer in to the core of a region, not surprisingly, because of the need to drive less predominantly is the reason for that difference. And statewide, transportation is the largest source of CO2 emissions. Another impact of our current patterns are impacts on water quality and as well as quantity. Construction runoff is a huge issue. Parking lots, one of the big themes for today, are obviously a huge issue. As you build more impervious surfaces, you have much higher percentage of runoff taking pollution and also limiting groundwater replenishment. And then there's also additional health impacts. As we make it literally the case that in so many places in this region and throughout the country, you take your life in your own hands if you do anything other than drive, the sprawl and the lack of alternatives have been linked to a number of serious health problems nationwide. So that's real quick on some of the trends, some of the impacts. I put this slide up here for a couple of reasons. This shows nationwide the amount of driving that we do and that we're projected to do. One of the reasons I put this up here is because trends are not destiny. If you don't need to worry about the numbers too much, but this tracks the amount of driving nationwide, and these are all the estimates of where we were going to be. And you can see that we've continued to estimate sort of a straight line projection of driving year after year after year. But if you notice something interesting, this graph starts to level out. Nationwide has been a phenomenon that's true in Virginia as well. This started a little bit before the economic slowdown. That clearly was a factor. But there are a lot of other factors at work here. I think one is a generational factor. I think that's one of the main things that leads us to doing things differently. Another is we have begun, even though the lion's share of our money still goes to roads, we have begun to shift that a bit. And I'll talk about that in a second. But really important, both that leveling off that's begun to happen, as well as just keeping in mind that the trends are not destiny. There's a lot we can do about this because there are tremendous opportunities, which I'd like to shift to now. Despite the severity of the problems we face, despite the impacts, there's a whole host of ways we can do things differently and do things better. Part of the good news is that many of these trends are the results of policies, often the unintended consequence of policies at the federal, state, local level. They're policies that can be changed. There's strong public support for clean air, clean water, clean energy. The changing demographics. I think that's really one of the important. You have the boomer generation starting to retire more, looking for less grass to mow, and also beginning to wonder how are they going to get around everywhere they need to go. And as they predominantly in the past settled in car-centric areas, you see increasing number of people in that generation now beginning to look for housing closer in. And then Gen X and Gen Y have been, many of you in this room, have been driving at a much lower rate than your predecessors. There's much greater interest in alternatives to driving, and I think that stems from a whole host of reasons. Greater awareness of environmental consequences is, I think, one of the most prominent among them. As I mentioned, also the awareness of the fiscal and economic impacts. That's changing the minds of a lot of people who really don't care that much otherwise about maybe the environment, but they care a lot about burden on taxpayers and the bottom line for the counties and localities. The equity impacts are another important thing that I think is driving a lot of greater attention and awareness to how we need to change our current trends. I mentioned the limited transit, for example, reach in the Richmond region. And then some of the market changes that go hand in hand with the demographic changes. But the key is there are abundant opportunities for change. The other thing that's driving things is technology. I'm not going to talk about that as much. I think it's really important where technology is going to make it, I think, not only making cleaner vehicles, but changing the way we get around. But it's also, I think, the changes in policy that are going to have to be happening. I mentioned the changes in market demand. We do see 60% of prospective home buyers nationally now saying we'd like to have shorter commutes. We'd like to have shopping, restaurants, things in closer proximity, including public transportation. And then there's also a change in households. If you look at the dominant household formation in the United States, it's changed radically in the last 20 years. It's no longer sort of the Ozzie and Harriet model of the 50s of a married couple with children. And that's what we built and zoned a lot of our country around, was that model. But there's far more single-parent households, individuals living together, individuals in combination, not in family unit. And that's driving a lot of the desire for different housing patterns and different transportation patterns. So some of the things we can do differently, and I'm not going to talk much about the particular policies, but there are a whole host of policies that can advance each of these objectives. But community revitalization, something that actually the Richmond region has done a fairly good job, at least for some of the historic building stock, in part because we have a pretty good state historic rehabilitation tax credit. Older suburbs in the Richmond region have largely ignored this issue until recently, saw it more as a city issue. But they're waking up to it now, too. Promoting more compact, walkable developments, more traditional neighborhood type style development. There are a whole lot of regulations currently on the books that make it almost impossible in many localities to develop in a more compact, walkable form. Things like minimum area of large lot sizes, things like separating of land uses, requiring commercial to not be located near residential, which effectively mandates sprawl. And so that's one of the important trends, encouraging renovation and redevelopment. As I mentioned, a number of tools for that. Infill and retrofit. There's a whole host of underutilized, and certainly if you look around the Richmond region, there's plenty of examples here, paved areas that have the infrastructure, they have the roads, they have the sewer, they have electricity, but they're either vacant or underutilized, especially a lot of dead and dying malls. A number of them have started to be repurposed in this region. This is just a visualization of some proposal, again, turning a very underutilized asset into one where we can target a lot of our growth and think differently about the future, a way to get at the problems with parking and promoting more walkable development. And guiding growth to more targeted areas. Where are we encouraging growth? I mentioned a whole lot of our policies, regulations, where's transportation funding go? It has tended to subsidize sprawling development and roads on the fringe of communities. But we can change that. A lot of policies available to guide growth or to existing and targeted regions. Critical piece going forward is to improve housing affordability. A lot of tools available for that, to create a greater range of housing choices, to make it easier to live near work. Having things like live-work units, more mixed use, mixed income development are just some of the tools that make it easier for people to live near where they work and eliminate many road trips entirely. And also making it easier to get to work if you don't have a car. Again, getting back to the lack of transportation choices. Part of that is promoting more transit-oriented development. As you have areas that have put more money into transit, then changing their zoning code to promote development, giving developers incentives to develop in areas served by transit. And promoting greener building. The buildings we do build, we need to be very attentive to energy use, obviously direct tie to fossil fuel consumption and a host of issues. Also, though, it's an equity issue. The average American household spends about 5% of income on energy, but low-income households spend about 16% of their income on energy. So enormously important, and a whole host of measures to advance green building as well. Providing greater open space and parks, both urban and suburban areas. And then promotion of local agriculture. Started to do some of that in the city. We have a ways to go in this region through provisions that recognize the importance of farming and promoting of farmers markets and the like. But one of the most important things, and a lot of this won't work without it, is promoting greater transportation choices. So what can we do? There's a whole host of alternatives. We're going to have cars for a foreseeable future, but we need to be have a more balanced transportation approach that gives people choices and a whole host of things available. Funding is the big hurdle, as are some other incentives. But often it's minor steps, things like putting shelters in place while people are waiting for transit, for example. Something that's been in the news a fair amount here recently is the proposed bus rapid transit for Richmond. This is a map of the proposed Broad Street line, which is the farthest along in planning, and just got an award, you might have seen in the paper, a planning grant award from the federal government recently. It's going to be a 7.5 mile length with faster service along this dedicated corridor. And that's the image of what it's projected to look like from RVA Rapid Transit, which is an advocacy group promoting bus rapid transit. This is an image they put together. Also light rail, higher speed rail. We don't have that right now in this region. Areas such as Northern Virginia, Norfolk with the Tide system, for those of you who've been on that, is a very successful light rail system, but also improving the rail system that we have from, say, Richmond to DC, the existing Amtrak service. And there's demand for this. Some of the most fast-growing rates of ridership in the country have been on some lines in Virginia. Regional trains, the ridership increased almost 100% from 2009 to 2013. That's taken a little bit of a dip actually this year for a whole variety of reasons, but we've seen just a rapid growth in ridership and interest in rail. And there's that ridership. And then we need to reduce the adverse impacts of the roads we do have and the roads we do build by increasing safety for pedestrian, bicyclists, more context-sensitive solutions and context-sensitive design when we do build new roads, taking more into account the communities and the natural areas that a road passes through rather than just trying to go from A to B as straight line as possible. And then reducing runoff is another part of that, moving from this standard pave it and just drain it to pervious pavement and swales. Even in areas with a whole lot of pavement, you can still significantly reduce some of the water impacts at least through steps like swales and briar retention. Reform of parking policies, one of the most important and often underlooked areas where we can significantly change the environmental footprint of transportation. There's a concept called parking cash out. A lot of people get free parking where they work, but this would, under this pilot program, gives an employee the choice of the free space or cash, that equivalent amount that it costs the employer. And they found that a lot of people took that deal and took the money, and it had an insignificant impact on driving alone and a significant increase in transit, bicycling, and walking. Other area for enormous change on parking is the amount. We have a lot of the parking is required by current codes. Developers have to put it in. I did some work, for example, in Nashville several years ago. They were finding developers were knocking down a lot of the buildings downtown when they were trying to encourage infill development. And they were asking them why, and it turned out parking was one of the main reasons. To meet the city parking code, they pretty much had to demolish a building for every building they repaired to get and renovated to get the necessary parking. So there are plenty of alternative ways of addressing this. A number of localities have begun to do it. Richmond downtown has loosened its parking restrictions a little bit, but we have a long way to go in this region. But that's one of the biggest things driving a lot of the oversupply of parking are those regulations. And we don't have much in terms of bicycle parking, or another thing some localities are starting to look at is preferential parking for alternative and electric vehicles. Talking about vehicles, so we will have a car for quite a while, but we need to further clean up the car. There's been some real improvements at the federal level in fuel efficiency requirements that's making an enormous, actually we have the cleanest fleet overall that we've ever had. But there's a lot more that states and localities can do to encourage both governmental and private purchases of cleaner vehicles. So thinking about transportation, that's a whole lot of steps just to give a taste of some of the changes and how we could do things very, very differently. But just to think about and rethink our transportation system a little bit. This is what we're faced too often. A lot of congestion, a lot of driving. This is kind of the reality of today. But to kind of begin to think about these things a little bit differently, this is an interesting series of shots that was done. Because the overwhelming number of car trips in this country are single vehicle, if you look at all these vehicles in the street, that's how many people are actually driving on that street. If you were to put them on a bus, you have an enormous amount of capacity and no need for any additional lanes. If you were to put them on bike and sidewalk, that's the amount of capacity you have. So it's just a way of thinking about, again, if we can lessen a little bit our dependence on the car, it frees up a lot of space and a lot of thinking about how to do things differently. Putting some of the pieces together, looking at how do we transform and retrofit some of the areas we've already built. This is an area in Charlottesville looking at some proposals for how we retrofit a very unfriendly area for bicycle and pedestrian. You can see very low density development, although this is in the city limits. Proposals to bring the buildings to the front, put in sidewalks, put in bike lanes, and this is how you can, totally reimagine and rethink and change these places through a combination of policies and investments, and completely change the economic and environmental profile. This is a real-life example. This is a town in South Carolina that changed its main street from this to this. a 60s uninviting thoroughfare, hostile to pedestrians, to they actually got rid of 2 lanes of traffic. And now there's enormous bike pedestrian traffic, and the rents and retail assessments of properties have gone up significantly in this area. It's much more economically vibrant now, as well as better for the environment. Another example, here's one closer to home. Proposed, this is from a city plan. We did some thinking. Dover Cole in Florida was a consultant on this, looking at some alternatives in Manchester. How, again, you can start to bring the buildings up to the curb line, put in pedestrian crosswalks and the like, and infill development, and then ultimately possibly add a streetcar, which used to be in much of Richmond. So I'll end there with just thinking about how we can do things differently. There's just a whole host of opportunities to address these interlocking problems, and you know, that trend I showed about how we have begun to bring down that curve of driving. I think that's part of what gives me hope about the future. But encourage all of you all to be involved and stay involved in pushing forward alternatives and ways that we can have the growth we want, have the quality of life, and have it with a much lighter environmental footprint. And I'll end getting back where I started with Parking Day today. As I'm sure many of you know, University of Richmond and UR Downtown are participating in Parking Day today. And students, and maybe some of you are involved in this, are actually transforming a space both on campus in the C lot, as well as a space downtown on 7th Street. And I've been told that you can take the UR Downtown shuttle on the hour, every hour, until 5 today to see that spot and some other spaces downtown. I also want to let you know that Monday is International Car-Free Day, which is designed to showcase how cities could look, feel, and sound without having cars being such an overwhelming presence. So again, just ways to think about and visualize how we got to where we are today and how we could do things very differently. And I think there just is an enormous opportunity to make these kind of changes and have a much more vibrant communities and much more sustainable. So thank you very much. And now open up to questions, discussion, anything anyone wants to ask or add? Yeah.
So as people who are interested in having more public transit and seeing the spaces transformed to be more pedestrian friendly, what can you do if you're not directly involved with government
Right.
to make their voices heard?
Well, that's a great question, and that is again, I think the most important thing is to make your voices heard and get involved. Because we are at a time, I think, in our society where, because of all the changes I mentioned demographically, but also the increasing awareness of the fiscal and economic and environmental costs, there's much more receptivity to doing things differently than there has been in decades. So just bringing it down to the Richmond region, there's a number of processes and planning things going on. I mentioned the BRT. The city's also looking at and working on a new bike plan that's currently still open for comment. They're also looking at particular projects in the city, like converting part of Floyd Avenue in the Fan to a bike dedicated more lane and area, make it much more bike friendly. I was on the advisory committee to the city's long-range transportation plan, and there's a whole chapter in there on things we can do to make transportation more sustainable. So there's a lot of interest in this. There's another concept I didn't mention called complete streets, which is thinking about designing, building our streets and operating our streets not just for the car, but for all users, transit, walking, biking. And I've been working with the city on an ordinance to adopt this approach. About hundreds of cities nationwide have done so. And actually this Monday, the council committee recommended it, and in about 3 weeks, city council will vote on it. So there's just a lot of things. If you're interested, it'd be great to weigh in on the transit proposal. RVA Rapid Transit is the lead advocacy group. Their website is a great source of information. The city, if you're interested in the bike plan, has you can find where to comment on the plan. There's also a number of strong bike advocacy groups. RABA is the Richmond Area Bicycle Association. There's also sports backers. So there's there's a number of groups in the region, and I'd be glad, you don't need to worry about writing them all down now. I'd be glad, there are a couple of reports that I've written in the back, but also available online at southernenvironment.org. And I'd be glad to give you email addresses of other groups or any of these other groups. But the fact is there are a lot more groups in the Richmond region now than there were even 5 years ago. The Partnership for Smarter Growth is also very involved in a number of these projects. And so there's just a number of ways to plug in if you're interested, and really encourage you to do so. Yeah.
I've been working on some research on desire paths here in the West End. Because you can clearly see that a lot of people want to walk between where they live and their little residential plot and where commercial is. But Henrico County has no streetlights and has no sidewalks.
Right.
But even beyond sidewalks, like a long forest between the middle school, they've added a walking path, purely because it's a safety concern and people walking. I mean, that was, I thought, a really great solution to the desired path. It isn't concrete, it isn't going to have a lot of runoff, it's permeable gravel. But where would a place like Henrico start? Like just the idea of the cost of putting in streetlights.
Oh yeah, right, right. I mean,
It's
it's going to take a long time, I mean, especially when you're talking about areas that are already built up and were built up anytime post World War II, pretty much. You're going to have these problems, and retrofitting suburbia is one of the biggest challenges we face. There's actually going to be a talk on this. I don't have the date at hand. I believe VCU is bringing in a professor, Ellen Dunham-Jones, is a national expert on retrofitting suburbia, and she's giving a talk sometime in October, but I don't have it on the plan. But there are steps you can do that aren't so expensive. So some of it's going to be costly and take a long time, but there are things you can do, bits and pieces, and it requires the citizens to get involved. The Henrico Board of Supervisors is not known for their progressive thinking in the area of transportation. However, they've begun to look at things much more in the last few years.
If there is a major road, if there's any major road construction, the sidewalk should go in. You can see along the top there's a section.
That's right.
But there's still a very deep desire path on others.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so it's just going to require more pressure. I mean, they've only recently taken steps like that comp plan amendment, but you're starting to see it again. The market's pushing this. Take another good example, speaking of Henrico, Innsbruck, the quintessential suburban office park, is now looking at ways to infill and redevelop, hopefully have some more walkability and transit, because they're realizing the market's changed and people are demanding it. People are demanding it, and that's what it takes. So Henrico especially needs some more advocacy. But hearing from people and homeowners, I mean, that's has already moved the needle in places like Henrico and Chesterfield that used to just slam the door on issues like this. They now are beginning to realize they need to grapple with it. The problem's so big, they're still not quite sure how to. And they're still saying this on one side and building new roads on the other. So there's a little dissonance still in these places that requires ongoing work. But there are, there's pots of money for available projects. You can get them in the capital plan. And that's what it takes. Yes.
I live in Palm Beach County in Florida, and specifically in the Boynton Beach area. And we're going through something very much what you're pointing out here. We have had restrictions on the books about the development of land and the conservation land. We butt up against the Everglades. And there are about 21,000 acres, which are just lying fallow. And the developers are dying to get their hands on it. And it's all that we as citizens can do is to help to try to control this. Because the development of this land would affect the composition of the air, of energy,
Absolutely.
of water.
Certainly the hydrology.
putting in new roads. It's just, it's a very difficult thing that we're going through now. Sure, people want homes down there, but we have a restriction that it's a 60-40% type of development, where you have to have 60% of conservation land for 40% of development. The developers aren't very happy with that. They're trying very hard to change that.
Right. Well, and those can, kind of conservation-oriented provisions can cut both ways a little bit, because if you save 60% here and 60% here and 60% and they don't stitch together very well, you can still end up with a very fragmented habitat. So, it's really important, as you say, that the growth and development coming to that area as much as possible to try to keep those areas intact and to guide the growth to areas that have already been developed and are ripe for redevelopment. But that's a classic type of struggle. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Has there been any kind of research into concrete ways to mitigate some of the hostility that cyclists and pedestrians face? I mean, there's been a lot of research into like, you can give people the facts, and sometimes
Right.
those dig their heels in deeper.
Right.
So straight education doesn't always seem to help. How can you kind of mitigate it?
Right. Well, that's definitely true. I mean, straight education is not always enough. There are quite a few good ideas that have died on the vine over the years, especially when you come up sometimes against special interests to make a lot of money off of doing something different. I would say on the specifics of the bike ped, I mean, a lot really is incumbent on the bicycle and pedestrian community, and they've taken that on some, because there are some cyclists who push the envelope a bit and they give a bad name for everybody else. We all have experienced this. And so I think that's a really important role for the bicycle community, advocacy community to play, and they have stepped up on that. I think that short of education, good behavior, keep working on your public officials, that's all you can do. Some of this is a cultural change. I mean, people aren't used to seeing cyclists in many areas, and they don't know how to react, and some people feel threatened by it. So some of this will, like I said, will take time. It's taken us decades to get to where we are. It's going to take us a while to get it. But if you do even look at even in the past 5 years, the receptivity to cycling in this region has changed enormously.
That is true. I mean, the bike share.
I'm sorry?
Charlottesville has a great.
Yeah.
It's a great example of how to sort of rethink the
Well, they're,
physical space.
exactly. So they're good examples everywhere, but it's the education is key, the advocacy is key, but the other thing is getting projects on the ground. And that's why I think things like the Floyd Avenue project is very important, because I think that will help show a lot of the neighbors who are very upset about that. I think we're going to realize it's not that big a deal.
Some of their pushback is kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
There are gangs of
Right.
cyclists shouting at midnight like that.
There's a lot of there's a lot of misinformation, right? And so some of it is just getting projects on the ground and letting people see how it works, because it is new for a whole lot of people in this region. But yeah.
Somewhat related to that, there was about 2 months ago in the New York Times an article about people's behaviors as it relates to speeding. And the idea was that since you very seldom get caught speeding, there really isn't a reason to stop that, but adopting things like speed bumps or camera, where everybody, you speed to get a ticket. I mean, there's not a lot of ambiguity about that.
Mhm.
Was bringing about significant changes in behavior. Are those kinds of things? Do you have any thoughts about just that?
I think, I mean, the cameras and stuff, one, that's very expensive, two, privacy issues. So I'm not a big fan of cameras, but what you point to is actually incredibly important, is the way streets are designed and the signals it sends. It's the enforcement, but it's also the design. You look at so many of our roads are so wide and the shoulders are so wide, it sends the signal that you should be going 45, 55, whatever, regardless of the posted speed limit. So one of the things that, actually Richmond's done a little bit of this, but is something called a road diet, looking at ways to slenderize some of these roads, to shrink sometimes the number of lanes, if that's possible, sometimes the width of lanes, sometimes actually there's kind of stuck up in the capital budget right now, but there's a proposal for one of the roads in Richmond that has a really wide shoulder to turn it into a bike lane, a dedicated bike lane. So there are things you can do to the design of the road that send the visual cues to drivers to slow down, and that's actually had the most significant impact of anything I've seen in the literature. Our speed bumps can help and things like that I'm not opposed to. Depends on how you do it and how aggressive they are, and that can tick off residents too, and they can be hard for cyclists. So you have to think this through, but the fundamental point you make is an excellent one. The way our roads are designed and enforced send strong signals to drivers about how to behave. And there's actually been some experiments with removing all signs, all painting, everything. And they found that drivers actually slow down more because they're not sure exactly what to do. Not sure we'll see you try this here anytime soon, but there's actually a lot of evidence that's been tried mainly in Europe that it actually resulted in significantly less accidents and slower speeds by just removing all signs. Because again, psychologically, you're now paying attention a lot more. And things like crosswalks and bike lanes that are very visible also really help with that. Just even brick pavers, just a slight difference in color at an intersection has been shown to have an enormous impact on driver behavior in terms of stopping at stop signs. So there's a lot of things like that that we can do, some of which is very cheap.
Maybe one last question, if you have time?
Otherwise, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
have one,
I
okay.
just wanted to mention, I find it very interesting because in New Jersey, I know that this all like kind of ties in from a federal level, what is being looked at, particularly childhood obesity.
Absolutely.
Are really a major concern from a
Absolutely.
federal level. And I know in New Jersey that there were a significant amount of federal dollars that came
Yes.
into the state. And as part of the childhood obesity issue, the Safe Streets concept
Mhm.
that is actually being implemented in certain communities throughout the state. You can't transform an entire city,
Right.
but they're targeting certain streets
Exactly.
where there's that they could promote a lot more foot traffic or bike traffic and putting in the bike lanes and things like that. So that's how some of those dollars are being used, and it really makes a big impact.
Exactly. I mentioned the health impact kind of briefly amongst all that, but that's a huge issue, and there's not only federal dollars. Virginia has looking at more active communities, active living, and active living by design. Again, looking at how we design our roads in terms of encouraging more walking, both for obesity, heart impacts. I mean, there's just enormous impacts, and it's especially important for children. There's actually a separate whole program called Safe Routes to Schools that looks at ways to let children bike, and there's some grant money available for that. Virginia's starting to get on board with this, some money through the health department, and the city of Richmond has an active living by design little effort as well, but needs a lot more resources. But exactly, that's a hugely important handle and a good way of getting at some of these. It benefits everybody, but the children is a really important piece of it, the health piece and the children piece.
Changing that mindset.
Changing the mindset, exactly. And that's what it's going to take. And so thank you again. Appreciate it.